I know you just want to rush ahead to see me draw like this, but please listen for just 2 minutes while I explain something really important for you if you want to draw like this as well. It's helpful with any drawing, but with complex architecture, it's particularly helpful to study our reference and see what patterns there are in the way the different elements relate to each other. Let me show you in this example that we're drawing now of the Museum of Natural History in Vienna. We'll just need to have a closer look. So let's see. I'm going to use these columns as a reference point, and I want to pay attention to see just where these Ionic capitals line up with the columns. And it's important to see that in fact they don't line up with the column, that the left side protrudes right over the left edge of the column and the right edge of the Ionic capital is basically, it's not far off the center of the column. The other thing I want, and that's the case with all of them. The other thing I want to check is these bits of protruding entablature, the horizontal blocks that sit on top of the capitals, is to see where the corners are. And the corners line up pretty much with that shadow line. And I want to make sure when I draw it that lines up. The other thing I want to pay attention to is with this, again, this overhanging corners on the entablature, is to see these corners, how far out they come in terms of the gap between the column. And I can see, in fact, they come a long way out. In fact, they come closer to the second column than to the column that they're actually over. Now, that's an important pattern to see as well, to see how those alignments are. And just when I look at this window, a lot of the patterns that we see are actually patterns to do with the foreshortening. And so I can see, for instance, that the gap between this column and that column, and then the gap between this column and this column gets smaller, and then the gap between this column and this column gets smaller again. And if we look at these windows, if we just particularly look at the part of the window that that is actually in shade or inside, we can see that it gets smaller, narrower, and narrower, and narrower. In fact, the entire part of the window that we see gets narrower and narrower and narrower. So as I draw, I need to place the columns slightly closer together as I go. And as I draw these windows, if I pay attention to the first one and the first space, then I need to make them narrower and narrower and narrower. And seeing that pattern will help me get it right when I draw. Not surprisingly, I start with one of the columns closest to us. This is always the most difficult part of any drawing, such as this. There's nothing there. Every line we put just looks wrong, and there's nothing to reference it off, and we're still just getting warmed up and used to drawing on the paper. So we need to persevere through this stage where really everything inside us says, oh look, give up, or start again, do it more perfect. No, I've learned that's not the way to go. I'd never finish a drawing otherwise. So I push on. I have a problem that my drawing hand is nudging the camera stand that's just off camera. So I'm a bit cramped now with that second, the right hand column. So I decide I won't draw too much off to that side. Now it's important to get this perspective angle correct, because that is a significant part of the visual effect of this scene. And it's a bit tricky to do because I don't exactly know where those lines are going to be, because there is that start, stop effect with the way the entablature comes out on top of the columns. But I'm working hard to get the perspective lines accurate, even if I have to keep adjusting the ones I've already drawn. I'm a great believer in, if a line's not right, correct it. The corrected line will look a lot less obvious than a mistake left standing there all alone, particularly in a drawing such as this, where by the end there will be lots of lines here. So this entablature, and they're the horizontal blocks that sit on top of columns, is going to be the most challenging part of this drawing, because it's quite complicated. There's lots of parallel lines that if you don't get them right, it can show. And there's kind of like two-way perspective here, going in both directions. So they take a fair bit of time. And yeah, in terms of the length of this video, they take the greater portion of time is spent drawing them. So It's a lot quicker for you to watch now. And then I get these cornices done, and now I'm working on these little blocks that sit under the cornice, in fact, and just creating the effect of the shadow between them. And they're really quite complex to draw, so I'm just doing the effect of the shadow. And then I get these lovely overhanging cornices, trying to make them as generous in my drawing as they are in the reference photo. We've completed what I'm thinking of as the scaffolding of this building, and now for the interesting part, now for the details. I decided to go upwards and to finish the top part of this structure. The important thing is to try and align the bases of these statues that also form part of the balustrade, to align them as nice and vertically with the columns. I only do a fairly ordinary job of that, I'm afraid, but they provide the bases of the columns, and because they're going to have the statues on top of them, it's important to get the spacing correct as well, because if they're in the wrong places, the statues on them will make that more prominent. So I pay a bit of attention to how they align with the columns underneath. They seem to all slant back slightly on my drawing. And then I put in the balusters, the bits inside the balustrade, and I'm just really, again, drawing the effect of those, because no one's going to study the balusters exactly. When I draw these sculptures, I'm just looking at the key points. I'm doing the head, the waist, the elbows, the knees, the feet. I'm looking where those points are. I align the head with the center of the columns underneath, and then I position all those points, and then really just join them up with a few swirly bits for the robing that they wear. I get the first one a little bit too large, so then I have to split the difference with the others, but that's not such a problem. So again, these aren't the center of attention, so I'm not overly worried about them. And now it's time to get that bottom perspective line fixed up and get that carefully positioned, and then it's time to start with the detail in between. So I established the center perspective line, which is actually a decorative band between the windows and the arches. So again, I position that carefully, because with that in the right place, it's easier to do the windows. And this is where I have to pay attention to the foreshortening that we talked about at the start of this video. I need to make sure that as the windows move from right to left, they become narrower, and particularly with that darker bit where we see into the inside of the building, I need to make sure that foreshortening works across those 4 windows that we can see. And then also with the decoration. Now with the decoration around, I'm drawing the effect of the decoration. I'm not drawing all the details. But with that, it's important still that where different parts of decoration align horizontally, that mine also aligns. So where there's a blob of decoration in the center of each side of the window, it's important that I have that happening as well in my drawing. Now I do these arches. The important thing is to establish the bottom of the arch. So I do that on the perspective line, and then allow for foreshortening. Next are the figures flanking the arches. This is not life drawing. I try to capture the effect of the figures rather than draw little people. So again, it's the heads, it's the shoulders, the elbows, the knees, whatever limb is most prominent from this angle. And because it's heavily foreshortened, it's just important to draw what we can see and not to even think of it as a person. There's a lot more decorative detail to add. Again, it's to keep all the detail following the perspective lines and to have different types of decoration look different. I like to add a bit of the darkest shades with this pen. At this point, this is just going to be a line drawing. So I want to show those really dark areas with my line, because that helps the building pop into 3D. Now this foliage down the bottom, I love including foliage, trees with architecture. It's such a wonderful contrast to the straight lines and the leaves with the stone. So it's always worth paying attention to how we draw the foliage. It's important that we don't make it an afterthought, that we don't make it just a quick thing. We need to put as much attention into every element of our drawing. Then there's some decorative relief work on the entablature, which I realise I've forgotten. And then I realise I've actually forgotten a couple of bits between the 2 columns. And so I add those. Many a detail like that I realize after I finish the drawing I've forgotten. So I add the detail to the top, and again I'm trying to capture the effect of those swags between cherubs. It's important to try and work out what it is before you start to draw it. And now again I'm just fiddling and playing around and trying to work out where I'll stop. I decided to add a bit more detail left and right of this little column section. So off to the left was fine. Off to the right, I've still got a problem with my hand bumping the camera stand. So it's pretty loose and not as much details there. And so I'm looking at this, I'm adding some more work on the foliage. I decide to create this diagonal line that goes up in the opposite direction to the perspective lines just to create a bit of visual tension. And I'm really happy with how that looks. Hi, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found that interesting. I certainly found it fun to draw. Complex architecture really follows all the same principles as more simple architecture. There's just more elements combined more closely together usually. So spend a little time at the start of your drawing session, really absorbing from the reference photo exactly what you're drawing, and particularly, as I pointed out earlier in this video, seeing the patterns between various repeated elements, because capturing those patterns where things are increasing or decreasing, where you're seeing more or seeing less, all of those patterns are really important to capturing the object, but they also make it much easier to draw because we can anticipate what's happening as we observe. And so we have that check on what the lines we actually put on the paper. But of course, the most important thing with all those lines on the paper is that we have fun. So I hope you did watching this, but I hope you do when you draw more complicated subjects. What have you got to lose? I'll see you next time. Bye.